Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Dragon Digital event. Welcome along this evening. Thanks to those that have joined us in person and everybody else that's on Facebook Live and watching it back on YouTube. So we're going to talk podcasts today. So everywhere I turn around, everybody seems to be doing a podcast, or they're thinking about doing a podcast, or people are talking about podcasts. The podcasts are everywhere at the moment. But should we actually be doing podcasts? So I'm joined this evening by Emily Crosby from Emily Crosby Media, who's going to take over from me, and she's going to explain about podcasts and whatever you can just explain about everything podcast. You're the podcast guru here at Dragon Coworking. So I'm going to hand straight over to you and let you tell everybody about those podcasts.
Brilliant. Thank you, Roland. I am just going to share my screen so you can see my presentation. Hopefully you can see everything now. So yes, podcasts. I am one half of my business is being a podcast guru, as Roland said. My background is in film and history, really, but I'm also a Radio 4 geek, and being that kind of audio obsessive means that I've slowly more and more moved into the podcast area. And currently I edit 5 podcasts that are all weekly releases, and I work with people both in production of current podcasts, but also starting up. So I have a package called Make a Plan where I can help you start a podcast from scratch. And I also do podcast audits for people who have an existing podcast that's been running for a while and you want to have a refresh, or make sure that your audience is the people you're trying to reach, that kind of thing. That involves looking at everything from your branding through to the sound of your podcast, and also surveying your audience to find out what they enjoy, what they don't enjoy so much, and seeing how we can marry the two together. So I called today's presentation Not Another Blooming Podcast because, as Roland says, everybody seems to be doing podcasts right now. And if you pay any attention to the media about podcasts, you see headlines like this all the time. Have we hit peak podcast? Are there too many podcasts out there? Are celebrity podcasts pushing out non-celebrities? All that kind of stuff. And it's true, there are already loads of podcasts. On May the 10th, podmatch.com, their latest figures were 2.5 million podcasts on all platforms. Obviously, that's a phenomenal number of podcasts. And I'm, as a podcast maker myself, I'm not here to tell you not to join in, but I do want you to think carefully if you want to make a podcast for your business about why it needs to be a podcast, what the purpose of your podcast is, and how it's going to work for you. There's a caveat here. If you want a podcast for fun, if you've got the idea of a podcast that will be a product in itself, so a drama, a piece of art, just something where you want to chat to your mates about whatever you like, that's totally cool. But particularly what I'm thinking about here is podcasting for business. Because like anything else with your business, if you are spending time and money on doing it, it needs to be bringing in something. Income, clients, leads, something, right? So you really need to be thinking about your podcast as an aspect of your business like you would anything else, like a marketing strategy, for example, like a new product you're launching. If you're spending money on it, it needs to bring money, contacts, people, customers in for you. So thinking about audience, I think, is the right place to start with that. This is some figures from the latest Ofcom report on listening. And the current statistics are that 25% of Brits listen to podcasts once a week. That's not an awful lot. That's some, but it's not as many as somebody in podcasts like me might think it is. If you look at these stats, frankly, if you run an accountancy business, you're probably better off getting an advert on your local commercial radio station than you are making a podcast to bring in audience. However, if your audience your client base are the kind of people who listen to podcasts, perhaps it's your way to go. So when we drill down a bit more into Ofcom's figures, these are the stats for the Brits who listen to podcasts more than once a week or more. And so this is really showing you who that audience are, the existing podcast audience. It seems to be skewed more towards the younger end of the spectrum. So you've got lots of people in their 30s and 40s there. And it's also skewed towards generally higher income. So again, if the kind of people you're trying to attract are pensioners, maybe it's not your way to go. But if you are trying to attract those sorts of upwardly mobile, slightly younger, I don't want to say middle-aged because I'm 40, but that kind of age range, then podcasts probably are the way to go. If you're thinking about doing a podcast, one thing you really can do if you already have a mailing list or a social media following is reach out to those people, because they're your core audience. They're really your hardcore people who follow what you do already, and ask them, do you listen to podcasts? You don't have to be like obvious about it. I'm thinking of starting a podcast. Would you listen? But you can say, I've been listening to this great podcast. Do you have any recommendations? Right? Because just asking that question will bring in, and if people are saying, yes, I love this one, or, oh, you should try this, they're obviously already podcast listeners, your audience. It's interesting to try out actually just on people you know. Obviously, because I work in podcasts, I often talk to people about them, from a guy who's come in to help me lay a new floor in my house to a mum at the school gates. They'll say, what do you do? And I'll say, well, I edit podcasts. It's interesting to see the demographic, which actually probably does reflect these stats, and the number of people who say, what's a podcast? And there are still a lot of people who ask that, or the number of people who say, oh, really? I love podcast. And those are the people you want to get. You might find, if you create a podcast and you have a dedicated audience already, that you draw in people who don't already listen. But using a new technology is another step for people to overcome. So generally speaking, it's still kind of the accepted wisdom that if your audience are already podcast listeners, you have more chance of attracting. So moving on from that idea of whether your audience, if you've decided your audience are there, I wanted to give you some ideas of what you need to think about to make sure that your podcast is sustainable and sustains itself. Oh dear. Hang on a second, let me go back. Consistency is really the key to a successful podcast. Of those 2.5 million shows that I talked about earlier, under 650,000 of them are still producing content now. So when you put a podcast out into the ether, maybe you only make one episode. Maybe you try it because you've got the stuff at home. You make one episode, you never do it again. I don't want you to do that. I want you to be one of those 220,000 who get to a year of their podcast, who get further than a year in their podcast, because that body of work that you've put out doesn't just get released one day and disappear like a radio show. The great potential of a podcast is that when you've created a body of work there, it's there forever, or, until for as long as we're all here. You can refer back to it, you can draw in new audience from it, you can show it and promote it in different ways within your business. And you've created a body of work that people can keep dipping back in and out of. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to reference podcasts that either I've worked on or I think are great, and show you sort of examples of best practice. When I'm talking about consistency, this podcast here that I've highlighted, which is made by my friend Stuart Goldsmith, is a really good example of that consistency. When you look up a podcast on the platform that I use to listen, which is Pocket Casts, it brings up this picture of the initial podcast. And the most telling thing that you can see when you look at a podcast on this app is the bit at the bottom where it says released weekly, next episode on Thursday. Now, he hasn't put that information in. The podcast app has intuited that information from his past consistency in making the podcast. And that's what I want you to be able to do. If you're going to make a podcast, I want it to be predictable for your listeners, and I want it to be consistent so they know what they're getting, and they look forward to receiving the next one, and they know when that is coming. So in order to do that, I've got three main issues that we're going to look at, three main ideas: the concept, the format, and the planning. So the concept, before you start to make your podcast, I think it's really important for you to drill down into the concept of what you're making and why. So I've just given a few examples here of popular concepts for podcasts. There's two here. Let me tell you about, and join me to find out about. Those are sort of, if you imagine your one strapline, your elevator pitch. If you're talking about, I don't know, farming. I've got a calendar above my head with a farm picture on it. Let me tell you about my experience of farming would be one kind of concept for your podcast. When you're thinking about your concept, you want to think about what your audience want, but also what you want to give your audience. Essentially, you're going to be giving away free content. So you want to think about what aspects of your work you want to share for free. You can go for an original concept, or you can go for something that's tried and tested, right? There are plenty of very popular podcasts that use an idea that has been done before. You don't have to reinvent the wheel because everybody's perspective is different. You just have to think carefully about how you're doing that concept. So here's a great example of a really successful concept. This podcast, Sustainableish, is one that I edit, but I didn't originate. I came on board when she made probably about 60 episodes. She's past the 100 episode mark now. And Jen's concept is basically finding out together. She is somebody who's really keen on sustainability, and she wants to make her life more sustainable. She's going for experience. She isn't the expert. She wants you to join in and find out more. So that concept informs her format, which is interviews, solo episodes, and discussion. So she mixes up her format to inform her concept. This has been really successful for Jen, and she's had great spin-offs from it. She's written 2 books now, and she's a regular on sort of speaking circuits and that kind of thing, because she gives a lot of her personality in her podcast, and she has gained a lot of experience, but she's not pushing herself as I know everything about this. She's it's a very accessible format for people, and she comes across really well. So as I said, that concept that you think about for your podcast can really influence your format quite clearly. When you're thinking about format, the kind of aspects you want to think about are the length of the episodes, the frequency of the episodes. When you want to do a series or an ongoing show, a lot of people make the mistake of thinking they have to do an ongoing show. You don't. If you want to do 6 episodes, 10 episodes, 12 episodes, there are lots of podcasts that are very successful doing that. If you've got a discrete amount of information you want to give out, go for it. And whether you want to have any regular features. So some people might, for example, like Brené Brown's very popular podcast has a quick fire round that she does the same questions with every interviewee that she has. Things like that just help with predictability, and they also give you something that you can share regularly outside of your podcast, maybe in your social media. So here's just some quick examples of formats: the 30-minute interview, the 1-hour discussion, the 15-minute Q&A. All of those might be applicable to your concept. So here's an example of the format being informed by the concept. This is Doing It for the Kids podcast. I don't have any influence on that. It's just one I like. Their podcast, essentially, the concept is that it's community building. They run Frankie runs a successful community on Facebook, and she partnered with Steve Roland to make a podcast that feeds back into the community. So their format is short questions from the community, and the following week they get feedback from those people in Facebook back into the podcast. So it's always a loop with their community. And the benefit of that podcast really is the shared experience for people. And some people will have found the podcast just from searching on a platform, which then adds more people into their community. It's that loop again. Another great example of format being informed by concept and vice versa is this podcast, Pause, Purpose, Play, which I do work on. This is essentially a sales and marketing podcast, but you wouldn't know that from literally listening to it. Michaela talks about how people balance their work and life. It's particularly for perfectionists and high-striving sort of overachievers. The format of this podcast, again, is interviews and solo episodes, but she's got a really good integration of the products that her business sells and great calls to action. So the benefit of her podcast is essentially that you're getting to know her, but she's also really good at selling her book and her course by using aspects of those products within her podcast, so that when you get the call to action, you've already experienced some of that product so that you want to buy more of it. So the sort of third aspect that I think is really key and that most people fall down on because it's a little bit dull is planning your podcast. When you're thinking about your podcast, it's tempting to just buy the stuff, set yourself up and go for it, because it really is that easy. You need a microphone, headphones, and a podcast host and you're away, right? I think it's really important to spend a little bit of time before you do that, before you hit submit to Apple, to think about what time do I have, what skills do I have, and how much is this going to cost? I come in to a lot of podcasts at the second series or about 12 episodes, because a lot of people get that far with the skills they have or having learned a bit about editing and then think, do you know what? I do actually have to earn some money. I can't spend all my time producing the podcast, editing the podcast, doing all the promotions of the podcast. So if you spend a little bit of time planning, at least you'll know whether you can do that or whether you need to get some outside help. This document here, this little screenshot, is just of a plan that I set up for a customer who was doing just a 6-episode series. And you can really see how much work there is then in just that 6-episode series. So 4 weeks before their initial release, they've got 3 or 4 things to do every week. And ongoing afterwards, they've got at least 3 things. This is the sort of bare bones of what you would need to do to release your podcast. Obviously, you've got recording, and recording is going to take longer than what you release, because obviously there's a bit of chat beforehand if you're interviewing somebody, or you're going to muff things up and want to do it again. Editing can take, if you're new to it, 3 times plus the amount of time you've got on your recording. And this is the essential thing that a lot of people forget. When you're planning your podcast, you really need to plan in promotions as well. So when I'm thinking about planning, one of the best examples of a podcast that has done that really well is this podcast, Design Your Business, from Sophie Day. Sophie knew that she wanted to do a podcast that was encouraging professional conversations between other people who work in web design. She's mostly teaches copywriting for people. And so she planned to have a format of a limited series. What she's trying to do is share expertise, explore best practice, get some networking going. It's essentially a bit like a conference, an online conference, but within a podcast. So she had a discrete series of 8 episodes. She released that in the spring, and then she's taking a break, and she'll be doing another one in September around a slightly different topic. The benefit to doing that is that she could promote that when it was going. She can still talk about it now during her break. She can then, a couple of months before, start ramping up for the new series. She's got a natural break, but she can keep referring back to those series later on. And it just gives a bit of ease to the process rather than having to do everything every week. And it means she can focus on talking to really great people that she actually wants to talk to rather than just everybody, because she desperately needs another episode. And this is just a little slide that talks a little bit about what you need to do. So anybody who is interested in starting a podcast, I have a free Trello template which talks you through every aspect of podcast production so that you can tick boxes and know that you've done everything. And this is the section that's about promotions and post-recording. So this is after you've recorded, after you've edited, you've still got all these jobs to do for each episode. Getting some graphics together so that you can share them, getting everything actually up onto your RSS feed and out into the world, and then promoting afterwards in your newsletter, in your Facebook, in your Instagram. To give you a sort of visual example of that, this is the promotional stuff for one episode of Powering Productivity, which I produced, which is a podcast based in Northern Ireland around a co-working space. And there's an audiogram there, which we share on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. We're focusing on those platforms where the audience already are. And then a series of quotes from the interview, which go out over the following weeks, so that people can still be drawn back into that podcast. One of my key tips for your podcast promotions is to remember that a podcast isn't a radio show. Just because it went out on Wednesday doesn't mean you can't talk about it on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, okay? Don't think that just saying, my podcast's out today is enough, because a lot of people won't see that. You need to keep promoting it throughout the week, and then, the day before the next episode is out, start talking about it again. So that is just a little clip of the audiogram, which is a little clip from the podcast, which is a great way of sharing as much information as you can and drawing people in again so that you get more listeners to your podcast. So that is kind of a whistle-stop tour of things I think you need to think about and ways you can make sure that your podcast is sustainable, interesting, and successful for your business. These are all my details if you'd like to get in touch. I do a much more in-depth version of that, which I'm kind of hoping to beta test shortly, which will be a workbook called Start a Podcast, where you can explore all these kind of concepts and think a bit more about how you're setting up your podcast before you dive in. If I can work out how to do it, in a moment, I will share it in the chat, share a link where you can sign up to become a beta tester for that project, so that you can think a bit more about your podcast before you set it up. But yeah, I think that's it from me. If you have any questions, do let me know.
Thank you very much, Emily. First of all, Alice, do you have any questions? I've got a couple of questions on Facebook, but Alice, if you have any questions, feel free to ask, or I can go straight over to the ones on Facebook.
Oh yeah, I have got a few actually. Yeah.
Okay, go for it.
I guess if I'm thinking two ways. I've got two business hats on. So one of them is in my work for someone else who's got a podcast, and then my other is for myself in my own right. And I've not got a podcast, but I am thinking about it. So I guess the first question I had was, if you have a podcast and it's out, like how many listens should you be getting?
That is a very good question. I think it really depends on what your current audience for your business is already. Because frankly, if you've got, 100 people on your mailing list, you're probably going to get 20 of them to listen to your podcast. Yeah. And so it's really sort of how long is a piece of string question.
Yeah.
I think, so podcast, in order to get advertising, a lot of advertisers demand a certain number of audience. Some of those start at 1,000 plus. Most of the small businesses that I've worked with are getting more and they're successful podcasts that win awards and get shared around, are getting more like 400, 500 regular listeners.
Okay.
I'm not sure that a massive audience is necessarily what you're going for. If your podcast is relatively niche, what you want is an active audience.
Yeah.
You know, like social media and all those other things.
Yeah.
And the way to expand that audience really is in the promotions, because just putting it out on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, there are, as I said, there's 2.5 million podcasts, so people aren't going to find you. What you need to do is be pushing it to your audience and expanding your audience all the time.
Yeah. And are there any kind of, what kind of equipment do you think people need to have as a standard?
So the two really key things, obviously, are your microphone, but also your headphones. I think they're the most important things. You don't need desperately expensive ones of either. Some people start off with a gaming headset. So that can be quite successful, because then you've got a mic quite close to your face and you've got headphones which are monitoring that mic. If you want to buy yourself a proper setup, Blue Yeti is a very popular microphone. Rode do a really good microphone. You want a USB one, and you want it to be a cardioid mic, because you want, essentially, you want it to be picking up the sound in front of it, not sound for the whole of the room. And you must have headphones on when you're recording. If you're going to be a podcast guest, you must wear headphones, because you need to be able to hear what's coming into the recording, not what's in the room. The other key thing, more than the equipment actually, is the room you're in. I'm in a terrible room for podcasting. This room has loads of flat surfaces and a glass wall, so it's like bouncing around. I might as well be in my bathroom, right? You're much better off recording in somewhere like your bedroom, where you've got lots of soft furnishings, or in somewhere like this. If I was going to mock myself up for a recording, I'd hang a blanket behind me, I'd put a blanket across the table, and I'd probably put some cushions out of view as well, so that they're just soaking up all that sound, so that it's not bouncing around everywhere and echoing.
Great, thank you very much. A question from Carrie asked the same question about equipment as well, but she's also said about, is it consistency over a certain amount of time that's really important? For example, once a week or once a month?
Yeah, I think when you're thinking about your format, making sure that you've decided on a decent schedule for yourself is really important. I think so what you want to get is subscribers. You don't really want casual listeners. You want people who've subscribed, because then it arrives in their feed every time. If you can only manage once a fortnight, don't start off by promising once a week. Don't do 3 once a week, and then maybe a fortnight, and then maybe a month, because people will expect it to come in at a certain time. You know, maybe they always go for a walk. You know, maybe they always walk the dog for a slightly longer walk on a Wednesday, and your podcast drops on a Tuesday, and I think, oh, I'll listen to that then, right? If it then starts moving around, it's just confusing. And frankly, if the longer a podcast stays out of your feed, the less likely you are to dip back into it again. So yeah, if you can only manage once a month, drop them once a month and have 12 episodes a year, and that be your thing, right? If people know that's what's coming, great. It's when you kind of mess around a bit and it's not obvious what's going on that it becomes a problem for people. You can also schedule on almost every podcast platform, so you don't have to physically drop them every month. You can make them all 1 month and then schedule them all for the year, and you're done.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, Emily. Okay, that's all the questions we've got on the Facebook feed as well. So thanks for all you guys that are watching on Facebook. Emily, so just remind us your website addresses.
Yes, so my website is www.emilycrosbymedia.com. I'm on Instagram at Emily Crosby Media, and I've got a Facebook page, facebook.com/Emily Crosby Media.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We'll also put the links in the description of the YouTube video as well. Okay, so thank you very much for everyone that's joined us on Facebook Live, and thank you very much for Emily for putting that together. Really appreciate it. And of course, you're based down here at Dragon Coworking, so there's a few members that are putting in questions there, so I'm sure someone's going to be knocking at your door tomorrow.
Yes.
So thanks so much, Emily, for putting that together for us. Really appreciate it, and yeah, see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.